Dr. Feenberg has published extensively on Marxist theory, the Frankfurt School and Technology, and among his most recent publications are the Philosophy of Praxis, Marx, Lukacs, and the Frankfurt School, and Technosystem, the Social Life of Reason. I think this is his last work, but I may be wrong, because every time I meet him, he has a new book out, so correct me if there is something else we should be aware about. And so please join me in welcoming Dr. Andrew Feenberg.
Thank you, Alessandra, and thank you for the invitation to speak. As you can see from my title, I'm going to present a rather abstract philosophical paper today. I will propose some ideas on the nature of truth and reality, entertained by Marxist philosophers in the period between the two world wars. A few years ago, one might dismiss such a paper as purely academic, fodder for debates between earnest graduate students and their professors. But today, these issues are all too relevant. Truth and reality are now front-page news and are discussed by the most fashionable thinkers. Before I turn to Gramsci and Lukacs, I want to show you how one contemporary addresses the issues that concerned my main subjects long ago. In 2004, Vice President Cheney told a critique of the war in Iraq that he, the critic, belonged to what we call the reality-based community, people who believe that solutions emerge from your judicious study of discernible reality. He went on, that's not the way the world really works anymore. We're an empire now, and when we act, we create our own reality. You might consider this the origin of alternative facts and fake news. We're living with it daily now. Bush may have failed to create his own reality in Iraq, but he certainly made a mess of what we use for reality in the United States and increasingly throughout the world. When Bruno Latour learned of this incident, he felt targeted. After all, was he not a constructivist who denied that reality is out there, independent of human beings? Had he not defined nature as what the victorious actors in scientific controversies proclaimed it to be? Was he not the person most responsible for the postmodern rejection of truth? If the most powerful actor, the United States government, now claims the power to define reality, who is Latour to complain? Latour responded to such accusations in a little article called The Emperor's Brand New Clothes. He imagined a dialogue in which a modernist, in quotes, I don't like that term, but he uses it, a modernist defends the traditional notion of truth as correspondence of thing and intellect, and blames constructivism for Bush. Latour objects that he is on the left, not the right, and has never supported Bush. The modernist replies that he has given weapons to his enemies by subverting the distinction between might and right. If reality is simply what people end up believing, then those with power create it. The emperor may be naked, but there is no reason to listen to the little boy who naively says so. I won't take you through the details of Latour's attempt to defend himself, but a brief sketch is instructive. It brings out some of the themes that we'll treat later with Gramsci and Lukacs. Latour tries to avoid a dogmatic scientism, that is to say, the view that science is the ultimate and only repository of truth. But he also wants to save the concept of truth from a skeptical or postmodern relativism that would fail to distinguish between science and politics. Common sense wavers between these two positions. Scientism implies a contrast between scientific knowledge, which gets at the truth of reality, and culture, which is relative to social circumstances and natural causes, such as evolution or brain structure. Science is objective and culture is relative, a local construction. Constructivists are accused of pursuing the relativist argument to its logical conclusion by incorporating science itself into culture. Skeptical relativism dismisses the truth claims of science and treats it as a socially and historically relative phenomenon, which, in a sense, it obviously is. But then, is science no different from the beliefs of any tribe? To sum up these alternatives, science is either ontology with scientism or myth with relativism. Latour attempts to escape the dilemma. Against scientism, he argues that there is no truth independent of social forces. His modernist discounts the role of society in order to postulate a timeless reality of things in themselves, known by a pure rational subject. Latour demurs. He agrees with Foucault, who said, quote, truth is a thing of this world. But Foucault is more modest than Latour. He confined his critique to social scientific disciplines such as psychiatry and criminology. Foucault did not concern himself with the validity of these dubious sciences. He argued that they require specific material conditions and powers which have consequences for their human objects. Knowledge is itself a kind of action when subject and object are both human. Latour goes further and extends the constructivist analysis to the natural sciences. This places him squarely in the dilemma addressed in his dialogue. He must respond to the modernist's objection. Crudely put, that objection holds that if the dinosaurs didn't exist until we constructed them, anything goes. Latour demurs once again, insisting that despite its worldly character, science has a valid claim to knowledge. It just doesn't have the monopoly of knowledge scientism claims for it. According to Latour, the way to avoid relativism is not to pound on the table and exclaim, I refute it thus, it's a quote from Bishop Berkeley's opponent, but to treat things as legitimate members of an extended society. Just as humans have agency, social agency, so do things. We are not alone in a passive universe of timeless things. The Earth's atmosphere has agency too, and that shows up in the rising temperature by which it reacts to our activity. Nature and society form a constantly interacting whole rather than two separate substances. The sharp distinction between them that characterizes modern thought since Descartes must be overcome by analysis of the actual complexity of their interactions. Once things enter society, they have a history. The discovery of the dinosaurs was an event in their existence as well as ours. Reality is not, it becomes. This has implications for our understanding of science. Dinosaurs are not simply out there, nor are they freely created by the human mind. They are constructed, this is Latour, they are constructed out of the myriad humans and non-humans that meet in the field and in the scientific literature, everything from fossils to transportation vehicles, museums, seminar rooms, and publications. All are involved in the reality of what we call dinosaurs. This leads to the conclusion that nature does not speak in the language of science. Science consists in humanly constructed notions established by associating many different actors in a network. The process of assembling the network is not arbitrary, as one might conclude from a purely social constructivism, but is constrained in many dimensions by its human and non-human nodes. I think of this as a uniquely difficult form of craft labor. Latour doesn't use this image, but to me it seems right. It's a unique form of craft labor which constructs a unique object, which we call facts. Latour's distaste for Marxism is well known, but surprisingly, the broad outlines of his position were anticipated by Gramsci and Lukacs, the two founders of Western Marxism. They too argue that the real is ultimately social, and that truth is a thing of this world. And like Latour, they are anxious to avoid scientism, while preserving science from the wreckage of the traditional notion of truth. Of course, there are big differences, but they too argue that things belong to history. Gramsci called this pre-postmodern view absolute historicism. And this is a suggestive description of Lukacs' early Marxist theory as well. In the remainder of this paper, I will compare the understanding of truth and nature in the writings of Gramsci and Lukacs. Both were influenced by contemporary versions of idealist philosophy, Gramsci by the neo-Hegelian Croce, and Lukacs by the neo-Kantians Rickert and Lask. These thinkers distinguished meaning from existence. They did not deny the independent existence of reality, but they also claimed that we can have no notion of that reality apart from some humanly instituted meaning. Natural science does not transcend this limitation. It cannot give access to things in themselves. This approach has interesting consequences for Marxism, which of course is a materialist philosophy. The idealist premise is transformed in contact with Marxism's historical materialism. What makes Gramsci's historicism absolute is the inclusion of science in the history of culture. She calls the superstructures in his Marxist vocabulary. Where scientism claims that culture is an effect of natural causes, absolute historicism reverses the direction of influence and interprets nature through the history of culture. The fact that historical knowledge is not firmly grounded in quantitative measurement and experiment does not disqualify it for Gramsci. It has its own methodological foundation, dialectics. Absolute historicism holds that knowing subjects are necessarily human beings who belong to a certain historical moment and who therefore can only understand the world through a hegemonic culture prevailing in that moment. Gramsci argues accordingly that the idea of a reality in itself That's the end of the quote. In sum, knowledge is a social phenomenon, part of what Gramsci calls, another quote, a historical block in which precisely material forces are the content and ideologies are the form, end quote. Gramsci notes that the distinction is didactic, artificial, since the material level of the block could not exist without its corresponding ideology. And the ideology without a material base would be mere individual fantasy. By this he means that societies are held together by a hegemonic culture. This culture is also the basis of knowledge. Knowledge is not an immediate relation of an individual mind to reality, but arises from and reflects the social world. Society is implicated in knowledge on the basis of its relation to nature, the material forces. Gramsci's historical materialism thus underlies his epistemology. But the matter he invokes, remember he says that matter is the content, and what was that quote again? Material forces are the content and ideologies are the form. The matter he invokes here is not identical to the nature posited by natural science. Rather, it is the matter actually engaged in the process of production. That is, nature as experienced through the mediation of labor and technology. He writes, and again we have a quote, "The various physical, chemical, mechanical, etc. properties of matter should be considered, but only to the extent that they become a productive economic element. Matter as such, therefore, is not our subject, but how it is socially and historically organized for production, and natural science should be seen correspondingly as essentially a historical category, a human relation." He goes on to dismiss attempts to explain history with a natural scientific concept of causality. What does this mean for our dinosaurs? As Gramsci defines it, the problem is not whether dinosaurs existed before they were known, but what he would call ideological character of the terms on which they are known. Knowledge does not give us direct access to a thing in itself that already possesses the meanings we attribute to it. Of course, the dinosaurs existed before they were known, but they did not exist qua dinosaurs. Our concept of dinosaur belongs to a historical sequence in which these creatures were designated and understood in different ways at different times. And that sequence is not finished, but may lead on to yet further understandings, further designations. So you understand that he's not saying dinosaurs didn't exist till we constructed them, but he says that whatever we can say about them, even the term dinosaur, is our construction. We can't escape from that to some ultimate reality. It adds nothing and is confusing to claim that reality already had the meaning we give to it today before we gave it that meaning and independent of our relation to it. To reject this confusion is in no way to claim that we created reality by granting it a meaning. It is to acknowledge that the meaning we grant may well be superseded in the future, and that therefore no meaning can pretend to designate an ultimate reality independent of humanity. Talk of such a reality as anything more than the occasion for knowledge, for future knowledge, is strictly speaking meaningless. Now, this is not a merely semantic argument. You might think it's just about words, but it's not. It has consequences for understanding the results of scientific inquiry. Where scientism interprets those results as ontologically fundamental and as independent of the process of their construction, Gramsci insists on their historical contingency. This is exactly the move that Latour is making. Gramsci also rejects relativism. Historicism is usually taken to mean that beliefs are relative to the changing cultures that characterize historical epochs. This notion supports the skeptical idea that no beliefs are actually true because all are relative to the particular circumstances of their birth. But Gramsci pushes historicism to its ultimate limit. At that limit, historicism ceases to be relativistic. He argues that it is the idea of an unattainable model of perfect knowledge, God's knowledge, that devalues human knowledge. Relativism presupposes a true reality known to God but hidden from man. It makes no sense to postulate a reality and a truth beyond culture. This is why our knowledge is not essentially defective simply because it is culturally inflected. The very definition of truth should be reconsidered if the traditional one has no application at all. I call this Gramsci's epistemological atheism. But surely there is a problem, since so many different views contend. The question is not just which one to believe, but whether to believe any of them, since no final test of truth seems to exist once knowledge is totally enclosed by culture. Gramsci has an answer to this skeptical conclusion, which is not so different from Latour's. Ultimately, he argues, knowledge is a matter of consensus rather than a supposedly absolute truth known only to God. He writes, and here again we have a quote, "Man knows objectively insofar as knowledge is real for the whole human race historically unified in a single unified cultural system. But the condition for such a universal consensus is an end to the divisions within the human community that cause so much disagreement. That, in turn, will require an end to the most basic social division, the division between classes. Thus, the triumph of the revolution will not only change laws and economic arrangements, it will also establish the epistemological conditions of true knowledge. To some extent, Gramsci says, this has already been achieved by modern science, but social knowledge remains contested under the influence of conflicting class cultures." This brief summary of Gramsci's absolute historicism shows how he would have answered Cheney had he had the privilege of meeting with a vice president like Latour. Political and military power simply do not get to the foundation of the real, in Gramsci's view. Neither the truth nor the social relativity of knowledge are to be found at that level. The real foundation is not specific facts, which power can, of course, create. Rather, it is the state of our ability to control nature, the material base. That state depends, in turn, on knowledge acquired through experience and experiment. The evidence that progress has been made is clear from the cognitive and technical superiority of modern science and technology. that progress is not the result of imperial fiat, but of a combination of social and economic developments and cognitive and technological achievements far beyond the power of any state. I will turn now to Lukacs' version of absolute historicism. He would certainly have agreed with Gramsci's remarks on objectivity, but he has a more elaborate theory of social form. Recall that Gramsci says that knowledge belongs to a historic block of which ideology is the form. Lukacs argues that the form of capitalism, in this sense, is shaped by what Marx called commodity fetishism. Capitalism is unique among social formations in assigning a price to all available goods, essentially quantifying social reality. He calls the result reification, from the Latin word res, for thing. The commodity society is reified in the sense that it presents itself as a vast collection of things subject to laws, the laws of the economy. Reification becomes the general form in which objects are perceived by the members of a capitalist society. But when everything is perceived in terms of its thing-like characteristics, other dimensions are obscured. These other dimensions include the human relations underlying the institutional realities of the society and the potentialities of social development. These are not facts subject to proper scientific study, and so are excluded from the reified social sciences. The reified mode of perception drives the individuals to perform the actions that reproduce the system. The stock market is a good example of this dynamic. The investor acts as an individual on the stock market, predicting future values in terms of the laws of the economy. But it is the multiplication of such individual acts that generates those laws and those future values. While the market looks like a thing, in reality, it is the systematic consequence of human actions. It's a kind of circularity between the way people perceive things and what they consequently do and the way they perceive them. Escape from the reified logic of the system is possible, Lukacs argues, for the social class which is forced by its everyday circumstances to see the human reality behind the veil of reified appearances. That class is the proletariat, which can de-reify the society starting out from the gap it perceives between its reified form as wage labor and the life process, of which that form is only an aspect. Here is a social thing that defies its own thing-like character. Lukacs writes of the proletariat, another beautiful quote, "The quantitative differences in exploitation, which appear to the capitalist in the form of quantitative determinants of the objects of his calculation, must appear to the worker as the decisive qualitative categories of his whole physical, mental, and moral existence." So the capitalist needs to lower wages in order to compete. That's an economic calculation, but the worker perceives it as less food on the table. The gap between reified appearances and reality is self-evident. This realization makes it possible for the workers to combine their forces in a social movement to overcome reification. Marxism, as a theory, is the translation of this realization into a method of social analysis that gets behind the reified appearances to the human reality underlying them. The theory of reification has implications for the concept of objectivity. Like Gramsci, Lukacs argues against scientism and relativism. The relativist must invoke an absolute which devalues the merely human perspective, whether it be God or nature. In every case, the relativity of human thought presupposes a sphere of being that is not relative, but that is fixed and eternal. This is the equivalent of Gramsci's remark about the God's eye view. Lukacs calls this the systematic place of being. In a passage that resembles Gramsci's critique of the God's eye view of reality, he argues that, quote, "It is only meaningful to speak of relativism where an absolute is in some sense assumed. The weakness and half-heartedness of such daring thinkers as Nietzsche or Spengler is that their relativism only abolishes the absolute in appearance. For, from the standpoint of both logic and method, the systematic place of the absolute is to be found just where the apparent movement stops. The absolute is nothing but the fixation of thought. It is the projection into myth of the intellectual failure to understand reality concretely as a historical process. End of the quote. In other words, it's the reified, thing-like appearance of the world that traps the relativist, even if he doubts all particular beliefs, because there is something solid and fixed and frozen in his world, namely this reified view of what is real. According to Lukács, under capitalism, nature as understood by natural science is privileged as the systematic place. He refers to Nietzsche's frequent references to biology as the source of cultural dispositions of one sort or another. Like Gramsci, Lukács is skeptical of mechanical materialism and rejects the scientism associated with it. The identification of the results of scientific inquiry with the thing itself, independent of human beings, is a vestige of theology that presupposes a view from nowhere. Science does not have a direct line to nature, but is a social institution. Lukács writes that objectivity is achieved in the real historical interaction of objective and subjective moments of development, nature and human beings, in its living interaction. This is Lukács' equivalent of Gramsci's historic block. It is the actual experienced world, analyzed in terms of the interaction of human beings and nature, rather than a theoretical representation such as science provides. The historic block is this actual experienced world, not a scientific theory. As the basis on which scientific representations can be constructed, this living interaction is ontologically fundamental. Gramsci could not read Lukács' work, but he seems to have heard rumors that Lukács was a dualist who opposed nature to society. In one passage, Lukács denied that nature exhibited the principal features of the dialectic, which he described as the unity of theory and practice, subject and object. Yet in another passage, Lukács acknowledges the existence of an objective dialectic of nature lacking these features. This has given rise to much confusion, as you can imagine. I think the undialectical nature to which Lukács refers in the first passage is the nature of natural science, while the ontologically significant nature for Lukács, as for Gramsci, belongs to history and is the object of labor rather than science. That nature, that historical nature, with which human beings are in living interaction and labor, does exhibit the unity of theory and practice, subject and object. But can scientific knowledge be reconciled with this version of the absolute historicist account? This is a serious issue for Lukács. His theory of reification attributed a general form of objectivity to society under capitalism. That society appears to its members as a collection of quantifiable facts. But quantifiable facts are precisely the way in which the natural sciences understand reality. Are the sciences merely capitalist ideology? That would be an absurd conclusion in a society in which science is not only a superstructure, but also a force of production. How to reconcile these two roles with each other and with absolute historicism? That's the question. Lukács distinguishes history and nature by their relation to human action. Lukács argues that the reification of social facts can be overcome by a revolutionary social movement, social facts. But that movement cannot overthrow science as though it were a political or economic institution. He writes, when the ideal of scientific knowledge is applied to nature, it simply furthers the progress of science. But when it is applied to society, it turns out to be an ideological weapon of the bourgeoisie. Why? Because unlike wage labor, in the case of nature, there can be no realization that reification is a mere appearance veiling a structure of human action. Human action presupposes the nature on which it works. It does not create it. It creates institutions, like wage labor. It does not create stars and planets. But stars and planets belong to history in a different way, through the cultural conditions of our knowledge of them. Capitalism opens a perspective on nature which makes modern science possible. But that same perspective obscures the dependency of social relations on action. Lukacs calls this a methodological distinction between nature and society, in contrast with an ontological distinction that would divide being into two incommensurable aspects, corresponding to mind and matter. True, science posits a timeless nature independent of humanity, but science itself belongs to history through its reified presuppositions. Lukacs draws an astonishing conclusion from his argument for the sociality of knowledge. All knowledge is culturally conditioned insofar as it depends on a form of objectivity that opens a perspective on the world. There's no direct line, unbiased by any culture, to reality. So you have to go through culture to reach reality. Normally, these forms of objectivity, go unchallenged as absolute presuppositions of knowledge. The Middle Ages made great strides in the advancement of knowledge of nature, all the while believing that nature was designed by God for a purpose. Modern science arose in conjunction with early capitalism, the machine forming its model of reality. Neither medieval nor modern scientists contested their implicit idea of nature. They used that idea as the basis of their discoveries. According to Lukacs, when the proletariat overthrows the reified form of objectivity presupposed by modern science, it changes the general relation of knowledge to culture. In class society, this is another quote, truth could only achieve an objectivity relative to the standpoint of the individual classes and the objective realities corresponding to it. But as soon as mankind has clearly understood and hence restructured the foundations of its existence, truth acquires a wholly novel aspect. When theory and practice are united, it becomes possible to change reality. And when this happens, the absolute and its relativistic counterpart will have played their historic role for the last time. End of quote. Now, this is an obscure passage, but to understand it, you need to know what he means by reality. The term reality, which we now can transform after the revolution, the term reality in this passage refers to the fundamental social relations that produce the institutions and forms of knowledge that characterize society. These relations are masked by reification under capitalism. When they become the object of conscious choice, as the proletariat de-reifies society, the form of objectivity is no longer beyond question. Reflection no longer meets an obstacle at the threshold of knowledge, but is limitless. Yet this does not devalue knowledge, according to Lukacs, but reveals it as the human product it has always been. This is what Lukacs means by his claim that the absolute and its correlated relative are finally transcended. In more familiar terms, he is saying that culture loses its quasi-natural character and becomes an object of knowledge and practice. Aha! Is this where Cheney wins the argument? Perhaps not with armies, but with television and internet trolls? Surely those with power today have the power to create culture for the rest of us. Has Lukacs given weapons to his enemies, as Latour's modernist complains? Not so fast. On Lukacs' terms, today's media managers can create particular cultural objects only by reproducing the reified structure of the cultural system as a whole. Domination through technical control is inscribed in that system, and it determines the content of cultural manipulation on the media. The one thing the dominant can never do is eliminate their own technical relation to their subordinates. So that's the systematic place that cannot be overthrown by simple power. Lukacs' argument is a version of a concept Marx once propounded when he described socialism as human control of history. For Lukács, history is essentially the formation and overthrow of cultural forms. Hence, human control of history must take the form of cultural self-reflection. It cannot be simply arbitrary, that reflection cannot be simply arbitrary, because it must start out from the existing cultural forms, which allow only limited possibilities of transformation. In socialism, as Lukács imagined it, cultural self-reflection is a process of de-reification, leading to an ever more fluid relation between the members of society and the institutional frameworks within which they must live. So he's not talking about simply getting rid of all reification and everything becoming liquid. Unfortunately, Lukács has little to say about this conception of socialism as human control of culture through de-reification. There's only one passage which hints at its nature. This is the last quote. He says, "The world which confronts man in theory and practice exhibits a kind of objectivity which, if properly thought out and understood, need never stick fast in an immediacy similar to that of forms found earlier on. This objectivity must accordingly be comprehensible as a constant factor mediating between past and future, and it must be possible to demonstrate that it is everywhere the product of man and of the development of society." End quote. In other words, there have to be institutions, and the institutions have to take on some kind of fixed form, whether it be a God-granted form or a reified form. But if you can properly think out the objectivity that these institutions take, you'll see that they are humanly created and can be humanly transformed. They're the product of man and of the development of society. An original concept of socialism can be developed out of this passage, but that is a subject for another time. So let me reach a conclusion here. Gramsci and Lukács succeed in historicizing science without falling into skeptical relativism or reducing it to power. They achieve this by eliminating the traditional concept of truth as access to things in themselves. I call this a finite horizon of knowledge. It characterizes many thinkers in the 19th and 20th centuries. For example, the early Marx, Nietzsche, Husserl, Heidegger. The fact that Gramsci and Lukács are Marxists links this approach to political action. They anticipated the coming of a radically different social world in which truth would be, as Foucault says, a thing of this world, not just in theory, but in practice as well. By now it should be clear that the question of reality is more complicated than Cheney imagined. Human action is implicated in the construction of reality, but not simply through the exercise of power. The failure of the occupation of Iraq to produce the intended results testifies to that complexity. There are many types of action, and that of empires and armies is not alone, nor even preeminent in transforming the world. Marxism acknowledges another sphere of action, which Marx calls the production and reproduction of real life. That sphere is more fundamental than empire. It creates worlds and makes possible the pursuit of knowledge. That knowledge-making is a worldly activity is the great insight Gramsci and Lukács attempted to validate in their construction of Marxism. Their absolute historicism stands as an alternative to scientism and postmodern relativism. Okay.